Long before the name Greece meant anything to the world, long before marble temples and democratic assemblies rose from the rocky soil, there was an island civilization that glimmered in the heart of the Aegean like a beacon of light. This was Crete, the land of the Minoans. Their society, vibrant and enigmatic, stood as the first great civilization of the European continent. It began nearly 5,000 years ago, around 3000 BCE, when the earliest Cretans began building the first settlements. Life centered around the land and the sea. The people cultivated olives and grapes, kept goats and sheep, and fished the clear waters surrounding the island. But what made them different from their contemporaries in other parts of the world was not merely their survival, but their flourishing culture. By 2000 BCE, the Minoans had begun constructing vast palace complexes, none more famous than the palace at Knossos. Unlike the fortresses of later warrior societies, these structures had no defensive walls. Their architecture was open, fluid, and graceful. The rooms were brightly painted, their walls adorned with frescoes of dolphins, lilies, dancing women, and leaping bulls. The frescoes tell us of a people in love with life, with movement, with color. They also reveal glimpses of religious practices, women in elaborate dresses raising their arms in ritual, sacred animals flanked by priests. Their religion remains a mystery, but archaeologists believe the Minoans worshipped a mother goddess, a powerful feminine deity associated with fertility and nature. She was often accompanied by snakes, symbols of renewal and the underworld. Shrines and sacred groves dotted the island, and cave sanctuaries echoed with chants in the flickering torchlight. Trade was the lifeblood of Minoan civilization. The Minoans became master sailors, building sleek ships with high prows and narrow hulls. They established maritime routes across the Aegean and beyond, connecting Crete to Egypt, the Levant, and Asia Minor. Minoan goods, pottery, olive oil, wine, textiles, found their way into distant markets. In return, they brought back exotic goods, lapis lazuli, ivory, and copper. This trade enriched the palaces and allowed the rise of a sophisticated bureaucratic class. From the palace archives written in the undeciphered script known as Linear A, we know that they kept detailed records of goods, offerings, and people. Though the language remains a mystery, it's clear that Minoan society was complex and hierarchical. The palaces served not just as royal residences, but as administrative centers, warehouses, and ritual spaces. The Minoan world was one of art, ceremony, and connectivity. Their pottery, delicate, painted with marine life, became prized throughout the Aegean. Their music, lost to time, is hinted at through images of lyres and flutes. Dances, processions, and festivals marked the calendar. Life was rich, rhythmic, and immersed in the divine. One of the most striking cultural practices was bull leaping. In grand courtyards, young men and women would grab the horns of a charging bull, vault into the air, and land gracefully behind it. Was this a sport, a rite of passage, a sacred act? We may never know, but it was clearly central to Minoan identity, appearing in frescoes, seals, and sculptures across the island. Yet even this idyllic civilization was not immune to the fury of nature. Around 1600 BCE, disaster struck. A cataclysmic volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, shook the region. The blast was one of the largest in recorded history. Ash clouds darkened the skies for months. Massive tsunamis ravaged the northern coast of Crete. Cities were flooded, fields ruined. Though the Minoans survived, the blow was devastating. Their economy struggled to recover. Internal unrest may have followed. And then came a new force from the Greek mainland, The Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans, warlike and ambitious, gradually infiltrated Crete. By 1450 BCE, the great palaces were destroyed, Knossos among them. Some believe the Mycenaeans conquered the Minoans by force. Others suggest a cultural fusion or slow domination. Whatever the cause, the Minoan era was drawing to a close. Their legacy, however, endured. The myths of Minos and the labyrinth, of Daedalus and Icarus, echo the memory of a once great people. The elegance of their art, the complexity of their cities, and the breadth of their trade networks laid the foundation for the Greek world to come. The Minoans had shown Europe its first glimpse of civilization, a civilization of peace, beauty, and ritual. And in the ruins of their palaces, future Greeks would build their own myths, their own temples, and their own dreams. Long after the brilliance of Minoan civilization began to fade, a new force stirred on the Greek mainland. Towering citadels rose on rocky hills, adorned with lion gates and cyclopean walls. These were the Mycenaeans, a people of power, pride, and battle. Their world, which began to flourish around 1600 BCE, was different from the Minoans. Where the Minoans had danced with bulls, the Mycenaeans marched in bronze armor. Where the Cretans painted dolphins and flowers, the Mycenaeans etched scenes of warfare and conquest into gold. The heart of this new civilization beat in Mycenae, a city perched on a hill in the northeastern Peloponnese. From its commanding height, the Mycenaean kings ruled over a network of smaller kingdoms, bound by language, religion, and a warrior's code. These were the days of Agamemnon, Menelaus, Achilles, and Odysseus, not simply mythical figures, but echoes of a real past preserved in the oral traditions that would one day form the Homeric epics. The Mycenaeans adopted and adapted much from the Minoans. Their scribes used a modified form of writing, linear B, to keep records. Their palaces had megarons, great central halls with hearths for banquets and councils. They built tholos tombs, beehive-shaped burial mounds, where kings were buried with weapons, gold masks, and finely crafted cups. One of the most famous was found by Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century, who dubbed a golden mask the Mask of Agamemnon. Yet, while the Minoans had built with openness, the Mycenaeans built for war. Their cities were fortified, their graves filled with swords and daggers, and their art reflected a world where death and glory were intertwined. Chariots rolled across the plains, and war boars' tusks adorned helmets. This was a heroic age, and its values, honor, vengeance, loyalty, would echo for centuries. Much of what we know about this time comes not only from archaeological evidence, but from the epic poetry of later centuries. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, though composed centuries after the fall of Mycenae, preserve tales rooted in this era. They tell of a mighty war, launched when Paris, Prince of Troy, stole Helen from Menelaus, king of Sparta. The Greeks, led by Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother and king of Mycenae, sailed across the Aegean to lay siege to Troy. Whether the Trojan War truly happened is still debated, but archaeological digs at the site of ancient Troy, Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey, reveal that a great city did indeed exist, and that it suffered destruction around 1200 BCE. It is not far-fetched to imagine that a war, perhaps over trade routes or prestige, was later mythologized into an epic of gods and heroes. The Iliad gives us not only a window into the war, but into Mycenaean values. Achilles, the greatest warrior, burns with pride and wrath. Hector, Prince of Troy, faces him in tragic courage. Kings argue, gods meddle, and the fate of men is shaped by honor and choice. When Achilles kills Hector and drags his body around the walls of Troy, it is not merely savagery, it is the expression of a wounded warrior's grief and fury. But beyond the poems, the Mycenaean world began to collapse around 1200 BCE. The reasons are complex. Some blame the so-called Sea Peoples, marauding invaders from the Mediterranean. Others point to internal rebellion, drought, or economic breakdown. Palace after palace burned. Trade routes fell silent. Writing disappeared. And with it, the grandeur of Mycenaean civilization faded into the ash. The heroic world had ended, but its stories would endure, retold around fires, sung by bards, eventually written by poets who remembered a time when kings feasted in golden halls and gods walked among men. The age of the heroes had passed, yet from its ruins a new Greece would one day arise, one that remembered the valor and tragedy of its bronze-clad ancestors. When the last embers of the Mycenaean palaces flickered and died around 1100 BCE, the light of Greek civilization dimmed. The complex world of writing, kingship, and trade that had defined the Aegean for centuries disappeared into the shadows. In its place emerged a darker, quieter time, stretching nearly 4 centuries, known today as the Greek Dark Ages. Gone were the monumental palaces and gold-laden tombs. Gone were the scribes who once etched records in Linear B. Even the knowledge of writing itself vanished. Villages shrank or were abandoned, trade routes dissolved, and the people turned inward, toward the land, toward survival. Yet in this period of loss and obscurity, a slow transformation began, one that would lay the foundations for the Greece we recognize today. Across the scattered lands of the Greek peninsula, small farming communities clung to hillsides and valleys. They cultivated barley and wheat, raised goats and sheep, and held fast to oral traditions. These traditions, myths, legends, songs, passed from one generation to the next, keeping alive the memories of heroes and gods, of Troy and Mycenae. Bards wandered from village to village, singing of Achilles and Odysseus, of Athena and Apollo. It was through their words that memory endured. In one such village, a boy named Diodoros watched the flame of a hearth flicker in the eyes of his grandfather, an old man with a voice like gravel and smoke. "Sit, child," the elder said, "and I will tell you of a time when men wore bronze and ships filled the sea." And the tale began, not read but sung, weaving images of lions and lords, of wrath and wisdom. In these centuries, a new type of society took root. Without the central authority of palace kings, power decentralized. Clan leaders called basileis ruled over small regions. Their strength rested not on bureaucracy, but on kinship, personal loyalty, and valor in battle. These were the ancestors of the Homeric chieftains, the stern, proud rulers whose honor determined their fate. Archaeological traces from this time are sparse but telling. Simple huts replaced palaces. Pottery became plainer. Metalwork declined. Yet there were signs of continuity and quiet resilience. The people did not vanish. They adapted. They remembered. One of the key transformations during this period was the shift in burial practices. Whereas Mycenaean kings were entombed with riches, Dark Age burials were simpler. Yet in places like Lefkandi on the island of Euboea, archaeologists discovered a rich burial from the 10th century BCE that defied the norm. A man laid to rest with weapons, a woman beside him adorned with gold, their grave marked by a long apsidal building, an early ancestor of the temple form. Such discoveries suggest that even in decline there were pockets of wealth and continuity, and perhaps even experimentation with new social forms. As the centuries passed, Greek communities began to stabilize. Iron, harder and more abundant than bronze, gradually replaced older weapons and tools. Agriculture improved, populations grew, and slowly contacts with the outside world resumed. Phoenician traders sailed west, bringing exotic goods. And something more, the alphabet. Around the 8th century BCE, the Greeks adopted and adapted the Phoenician script to suit their language. For the first time in centuries, they wrote again. But this time, it was not for palace inventories or tribute lists. It was for poetry. Somewhere, perhaps in Ionia, on the coast of Asia Minor, a poet began to compose a tale. His name may have been Homer, or perhaps he was a figurehead for a tradition. But what he gave the world was unforgettable. The Iliad and the Odyssey, monumental works that gave form and structure to centuries of oral tradition. They were not just stories, they were mirrors of Greek identity. In these epics, the values of the age were encoded: honor, glory, loyalty, and fate. But also the pain of loss, the complexity of heroism, and the ever-present will of the gods. They became and remain the cornerstone of Greek literature. The revival of writing coincided with other signs of rebirth. Communities grew into towns, temples began to appear, sanctuaries like Delphi and Olympia rose in importance. And along with religious revival came the first stirrings of political change. Instead of kings, councils of elders, and assemblies of warriors began to shape decisions. The seeds of the polis, the city-state, were planted. By 750 BCE, Greece was no longer in the dark. Though the shadows of the Mycenaeans lingered, a new civilization was rising, one forged not in palaces, but in firelight and memory. The Greek Dark Ages were not simply a time of loss. They were a crucible. In their long night, the Greeks remembered who they were, and in doing so, dreamed of who they could become. The dawn of the 8th century BCE witnessed a rebirth that pulsed through the scattered lands of Greece, like a quiet but persistent rhythm. Out of the quiet valleys and windswept coasts rose a new kind of political and social structure, the polis. The polis, part city, part state, part community, emerged as the dominant force of Greek life. It was more than just a collection of buildings. It was a body of citizens bound by shared identity, worship, and civic duty. In a clearing where once only goats had grazed, a group of farmers erected a stone altar to Athena. This modest act would, in time, become the spiritual heart of what would be Athens. Similar stories unfolded in other corners of the Greek world. In Corinth, a shrewd merchant named Archias gathered local families and established a code of mutual defense and fair trade. On the island of Rhodes, a shepherd-turned-lawgiver called the people to assemblies under olive trees. What defined the polis wasn't wealth or size, but structure. At its core stood the agora, the public square. Here, men debated policy, traded goods, and listened to wandering poets. Above the agora stood the Acropolis, a fortified hill home to temples and the city's most sacred spaces. Encircling all were the homes of citizens, farms, and, later, walls of stone and clay. The emergence of the polis also marked a shift in values. The community, not the king, became the center of loyalty. While basileis still ruled in some regions, their power was increasingly tempered by councils and popular assemblies. These early experiments in governance planted the seeds for future democracy. The Greeks began to define themselves less by lineage and more by their polis. A man from Argos was not simply a Greek. He was an Argive. A woman from Sparta carried not only a Doric accent, but the austere pride of her city. The rivalry between polis grew fierce. They competed in trade, in warfare, in games. To ease internal tensions, many cities turned to lawgivers, wise men tasked with crafting rules to bring order. In Athens, a man named Draco gave the city its first written code, harsh but clear. Later, Solon would temper these laws with justice and equity, laying the groundwork for what would become a radically participatory system. In Sparta, a different model took root. Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver, reshaped the city into a militarized state. Spartan boys left home at 7 to be trained as warriors. Their lives were governed by discipline, austerity, and loyalty to the state. Women, unusually, were granted freedoms rare in the ancient world, for they too were expected to raise warriors. As the polis matured, so did their cultural expressions. Art flourished, from the geometric designs of early pottery to more naturalistic sculpture. Temples evolved from wood and mud brick to marble and limestone, adorned with columns and friezes that told stories of gods and heroes. Religion was ever present. Each polis had its patron deity: Athena in Athens, Apollo in Delphi, Artemis in Ephesus. Festivals were held with sacred processions, sacrifices, and contests. Music, poetry, and athleticism were intertwined with worship, embodying the ideal of a balanced, harmonious life. Yet as these communities grew, so did the pressure on resources. Land was limited, and younger sons, lacking inheritance, looked outward. This led to the great wave of colonization. From the 8th to the 6th centuries BCE, Greeks established colonies across the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Some, like Syracuse in Sicily or Byzantium near the Bosporus, would rise to become powerful cities in their own right. These colonies were not outposts of empire, but independent polis, linked by kinship and language, but free to forge their own destinies. Colonization spread Greek ideas, language, and art across vast distances. It also brought them into contact and conflict with other peoples: Etruscans, Phoenicians, Persians. The Greeks began to understand themselves not only in terms of internal differences, but in contrast to the barbaroi, the outsiders who spoke in unfamiliar tongues. Meanwhile, new forms of warfare emerged. The phalanx, a tight formation of hoplites, citizen soldiers with shields and spears, revolutionized battle. It was a symbol of the polis itself: unity, discipline, shared risk. Each man depended on the one beside him. It was not the glory of a single hero that won the day, but the cohesion of the whole. These centuries were not peaceful. Rivalries simmered and sometimes boiled over into war. Yet, in this crucible of conflict and cooperation, the Greek world matured. The polis became not just a place, but a way of life, a model of belonging, identity, and civic virtue that would shape political thought for millennia. As the 6th century drew to a close, the stage was set. Athens, having cast off tyrants and embraced reform, stood on the cusp of something extraordinary. In the east, a vast empire stirred, an empire that would test the strength and unity of the Greek polis like never before. The age of the polis had begun, and the world would never be the same. By the early 6th century BCE, as the Greek world settled into the rhythm of its maturing city-states, a new revolution began to take root. It wasn't sparked by kings, generals, or even the architects of towering temples. This revolution took place in the minds of men. Where once the Greeks had turned to the gods to explain the world, the thunder of Zeus, the harvest of Demeter, they now began to ask a new question. What if the universe could be understood through observation, reason, and logic? This intellectual awakening began in Ionia, a region on the western coast of Asia Minor. The bustling cities of Miletus, Ephesus, and Samos were crossroads of cultures, trading hubs that welcomed Egyptian astronomers, Babylonian mathematicians, and Phoenician merchants. Among these people lived a man named Thales of Miletus. He is often credited as the first philosopher, or as the Greeks called them, lovers of wisdom. Thales rejected the idea that the gods were responsible for natural phenomena. Instead, he proposed that water was the fundamental substance from which all things derived. While this might seem simple to modern ears, it was radical in its time. Thales attempted to explain the world through a unifying principle, a first in recorded history. His successors in Miletus, Anaximander and Anaximenes, expanded this approach. Anaximander proposed the existence of an indefinite, boundless substance, the apeiron, as the origin of all matter. Anaximenes, in turn, suggested that air was the primary substance, shaping all things through rarefaction and condensation. Meanwhile, in Ephesus, Heraclitus observed the ever-changing world around him and declared, "Everything flows." He believed that fire was the fundamental element, not just a physical substance, but a symbol of constant change and transformation. He saw conflict as the driving force of existence, famously stating, "War is the father of all things." These early thinkers were more than scientists. They were metaphysicians, cosmologists, and critics of traditional myth. They did not deny the existence of the gods, but they sought to move beyond the stories of Homer and Hesiod. To them, knowledge came not from divine revelation, but from the senses and the mind. The island of Samos gave birth to Pythagoras, a mystic and mathematician whose influence would stretch across millennia. Pythagoras believed that numbers were the true essence of reality. He and his followers discovered that harmony in music could be expressed mathematically, and from this they deduced that the entire cosmos was a form of harmony, a music of the spheres. In southern Italy, another Greek colony called Elea became the cradle of a different kind of philosophical thought. Here lived Parmenides, who challenged the very nature of reality itself. In a dense and poetic prose, he argued that change was an illusion and that true being was eternal, unchanging and indivisible. His student, Zeno, would become famous for his paradoxes, clever arguments that revealed contradictions in common assumptions about space, motion, and plurality. While these pre-Socratic philosophers searched the cosmos for order, another intellectual movement arose that focused on human society. In Athens and other polis, the increasing complexity of public life created a demand for education and rhetoric. Enter the sophists, teachers who offered instruction in language, persuasion, and civic virtue. Some, like Protagoras, argued that man is the measure of all things, suggesting a form of relativism that scandalized traditionalists. Yet the most profound developments were still to come. In the late 5th century BCE, amid the turmoil of war and the rise of Athenian democracy, a man named Socrates emerged. He wrote nothing himself but left a legacy through his student, Plato. Socrates questioned everything, wandering the streets of Athens, engaging in debate with anyone who would listen. He believed that truth could be uncovered through persistent inquiry, what became known as the Socratic method. Socrates' devotion to reason and moral clarity would cost him his life. In 399 BCE, accused of corrupting the youth and impiety, he stood trial before the Athenian assembly. He refused to back down, famously declaring, "The unexamined life is not worth living." He was condemned and drank hemlock, dying in the presence of his students. But his ideas would echo through eternity. Plato, shaken by his teacher's death, founded the Academy, a school that would endure for centuries. In his dialogues, he explored themes of justice, love, reality, and the ideal state. He imagined a world of perfect forms, transcendent ideals that existed beyond the physical realm. For Plato, the material world was a shadow, and true knowledge was a kind of remembering of the soul's divine origin. Plato's student, Aristotle, took a different path. A tireless observer and classifier, Aristotle grounded his philosophy in empirical observation. He wrote on ethics, biology, politics, logic, and metaphysics. He believed in the power of reason to understand the world as it is, rather than as an ideal. To him, the golden mean was the path to virtue, balance between excess and deficiency. Philosophy in ancient Greece was never a closed circle. It spilled into every realm: politics, science, art, education. It inspired poets and lawmakers, sculptors and strategists. It created a climate of inquiry that challenged authority and tradition, that demanded clarity of thought and rigor of argument. By the end of the classical period, philosophy had become one of Greece's greatest legacies. It offered not only theories of atoms and ethics, but a new way of living, one guided not by fear of divine caprice, but by the inner light of reason. It taught that wisdom was the highest good, that a just life was a noble pursuit, and that in the quiet recesses of the mind one might glimpse the eternal. This was the true miracle of Greece, not just temples or triumphs in war, but a revolution of thought that would shape the destiny of civilizations to come. The city of Athens did not rise overnight. It was built slowly atop the bones of kings and myth, on a foundation of soil both bloodied and rich with promise. Its early kings, Cecrops, Theseus, and Codrus, were legendary, their stories etched in the collective memory of the people, like the very statues that would one day line the Acropolis. But it was not kings who would define Athens. It was the people. In the centuries that followed the Greek Dark Ages, the scattered settlements of Attica began to coalesce around a central hill. The Acropolis, a natural fortress, became the spiritual and political heart of Athens. The city grew outward from it like the ripples of a pebble dropped in water: agora, temples, homes, workshops, and farms. The soil of Attica was poor, but the minds of its people were rich. At first, Athens was like many poleis, ruled by aristocratic families who claimed divine descent. The Eupatride, or well-born, monopolized political power, hoarding land and law. Common citizens, artisans, farmers, and laborers had little voice and even less protection from injustice. The social tensions simmered dangerously. Debt slavery, a cruel custom that forced many to sell their freedom to survive, left thousands dispossessed. It was into this climate that a man named Draco first codified Athenian law in the 7th century BCE. His laws were notoriously harsh, so severe that the term draconian survives to this day. Theft could result in death. Disobedience was met with swift brutality. But even harsh laws were a beginning. For the first time, the rules of the elite were written and public. Power could be held accountable. By the early 6th century BCE, discontent boiled over again. The poor demanded reform, and in 594 BCE, the Athenians turned to a respected statesman named Solon. Solon was a poet and a merchant, a man who understood the complexities of commerce and the human heart alike. His reforms were sweeping. He canceled debts and freed those enslaved by them. He reorganized the political system, dividing citizens into classes based on wealth, not birth, and allowed broader participation in government. Though Solon refused tyranny, his reforms only partially quelled the unrest. Factions remained, and soon another figure rose: Pisistratus, a cunning and charismatic noble Pisistratus seized power and became a tyrant in the classical sense, a ruler who gained control outside traditional laws. Yet his tyranny was marked by prosperity. He redistributed land, promoted the arts, and beautified Athens. Under his rule, Athens began to believe in itself as more than a city. It was an idea. When Pisistratus died, his sons Hippias and Hipparchus ruled. Hipparchus was assassinated in 514 BCE, and Hippias, driven by paranoia, became a cruel despot. In response, the people, led by the noble Alcmaeonid family, and with the aid of Sparta, expelled him. The last vestiges of tyranny crumbled, and the stage was set for something new. Enter Cleisthenes, often called the father of Athenian democracy. Cleisthenes reorganized the citizen body into 10 tribes, mixing people from all regions, coast, city, and inland. This broke the power of regional clans. He created the Council of 500, chosen by lot, and opened more positions to everyday citizens. Ostracism, a peculiar but effective mechanism, allowed the people to vote out any citizen they feared might seize too much power. For the first time in human history, power did not flow from bloodlines or conquest. It flowed from the demos, the people. Men gathered in the assembly to debate and decide laws. Juries of citizens judged guilt and innocence. The streets buzzed with political life. Slaves and women remained excluded. But for free men, Athens had become a beacon of civic freedom. Democracy was not perfect. It was fragile, messy, and often swayed by rhetoric more than reason. But it allowed for an unprecedented flowering of human potential. Poets like Aeschylus and Sophocles found patrons and audiences. Sculptors adorned public spaces with marble testaments to the gods and human form. Philosophers like Socrates questioned everything. The agora became not just a market, but a theater of ideas. The Persian threat loomed during this rise. When the armies of Darius I crossed the Aegean to punish the Greek cities for aiding the Ionian revolt, Athens answered the call. At Marathon in 490 BCE, the citizen soldiers of Athens met the Persian tide and turned it back. The victory electrified the city. Here was proof that a citizen army could defeat an empire. 10 years later, the Persians returned under Xerxes. Themistocles, a brilliant and often underestimated statesman, had foreseen the danger. He convinced the Athenians to build a fleet of triremes, sleek, fast warships with bronze beaks. When the Persians burned Athens, it seemed the city was lost. But at Salamis, Themistocles led the fleet in a stunning naval ambush that turned the tide of the war. Victory gave Athens prestige, and it used that prestige to forge the Delian League, an alliance of city-states meant to defend against Persia. But over time, the League became an empire in all but name. Tribute poured into Athens, funding the construction of the Parthenon and filling its coffers. Under the leadership of Pericles, Athens entered a golden age. The city glowed. Artists, architects, and orators vied for excellence. Arete. The Acropolis rose in gleaming marble. The Parthenon, dedicated to Athena, was a statement of divine favor and civic pride. The theater of Dionysus rang with the tragedies of Euripides and the comedies of Aristophanes. The assembly debated laws, while philosophers walked the colonnades. But with glory came arrogance. Athens began to act not as a leader of allies, but as a master of subjects. Dissenting city-states were punished, revolts were crushed. When Sparta and its allies grew wary of Athenian power, conflict became inevitable. The Peloponnesian War, as it came to be known, would test the resilience of Athens and its democracy. The The Peloponnesian War was not just a clash of arms, it was a collision of ideologies, cultures, and ambitions. For nearly 3 decades, the Greek world tore itself apart in a contest between the two most powerful city-states, democratic Athens and oligarchic Sparta. What began as a war of dominance would become a struggle that defined a civilization and signaled the beginning of its fragmentation. In the years following the Persian Wars, Athens stood astride the Aegean like a titan. The Delian League, originally conceived as a voluntary alliance against Persian aggression, had morphed into the Athenian Empire. Member states were compelled to contribute ships, soldiers, or, more often, silver, which Athens used to build its fleet and finance its monumental architecture. The treasury, once housed on the sacred island of Delos, was moved to Athens. The message was clear. Athens was in charge. Sparta, meanwhile, remained the austere guardian of the Peloponnesian League, a coalition of land-based powers. Sparta's dual monarchy and strict social order made it a conservative force, suspicious of Athenian innovation and influence. While Athens built temples, theaters, and academies, Sparta trained warriors and scorned luxury. Tensions between the two powers simmered for decades. Small conflicts flared, disputes over allies, trade routes, and regional dominance. Each side accused the other of aggression. In 431 BCE, following a skirmish involving Corcyra, a colony of Corinth, and Potidæa, an Athenian ally, open war broke out. Thucydides, the Athenian general and historian, chronicled the war with remarkable clarity. He saw it not as the result of any single event, but of deeper fears. The real cause, he wrote, was the growth of Athenian power and the fear this caused in Sparta. The early years of the war, often called the Archidamian War after the Spartan king Archidamus II, saw an uneasy stalemate. Sparta, superior on land, raided the Athenian countryside, burning farms and vineyards. But the Athenians, following the strategy of Pericles, refused to meet Sparta in open battle. Instead, they withdrew behind their walls and used their fleet to raid the Peloponnesian coast. This strategy, though sound, had unintended consequences. With the countryside abandoned and the city overcrowded, plague swept through Athens in 430 BCE. It killed thousands, including Pericles himself. The city reeled from the loss. Morale plummeted. Leadership passed to more aggressive figures like Cleon, whose bellicose style led to escalating violence and atrocities. The war dragged on. Battles flared in distant corners of the Greek world, from Sicily to Thrace. In 421 BCE, a temporary truce known as the Peace of Nicias was signed, but it failed to hold. Both sides continued to maneuver, shifting alliances and seizing opportunities. One of the most dramatic episodes of the war was the Sicilian expedition. In 415 BCE, Alcibiades, a brilliant but controversial Athenian statesman, convinced the assembly to launch a massive campaign against the wealthy city of Syracuse in Sicily. He promised wealth, glory, and strategic advantage. But before the fleet could arrive, Alcibiades was recalled to stand trial for impiety. He fled to Sparta instead. The expedition was a catastrophe. Poor planning, internal division, and the formidable resistance of Syracuse, aided by Sparta, led to disaster. The entire Athenian fleet was destroyed. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or enslaved. The news sent shockwaves through Athens. A once invincible city had been humbled. Sparta seized the momentum. With Persian gold now backing them and a rebuilt fleet, the Spartans began to challenge Athenian supremacy at sea. The final phase of the war, known as the Ionian or Decelean War, saw brutal conflict, shifting allegiances, and deepening despair. In 404 BCE, after years of siege, starvation, and internal strife, Athens surrendered. Its walls were torn down, its fleet dismantled, and its democracy suspended. Sparta, triumphant, imposed an oligarchic regime, the 30 Tyrants. Yet the victory was Pyrrhic. Greece was exhausted. The war had consumed generations, drained treasuries, and eroded the ideals that once defined Hellenic civilization. Thucydides ended his history before the war concluded, but his insights endure. He saw the war not just as a military conflict, but as a moral and political crisis. War, he wrote, is a violent teacher. The Peloponnesian War left Greece fractured and vulnerable. New powers loomed on the horizon, and the age of the polis, independent and proud, was nearing its end. In the years following the Peloponnesian War, Greece was a fractured mosaic of city-states, burdened by exhaustion and mutual distrust. The great powers, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, had all tasted the bitterness of war and the emptiness of temporary triumph. None could sustain long-term dominance. Into this void emerged a kingdom long regarded as a backwater, Macedon. Nestled to the north of the traditional Greek world, Macedon had often been dismissed by the southern Greeks as semi-barbaric. Its people spoke a dialect of Greek, worshipped the Olympian gods, and claimed descent from Heracles himself, but their politics and customs were rougher, more autocratic. The Macedonian kings ruled not as equals among citizens, but as absolute monarchs. Yet it was precisely this centralized power that would allow one man to reshape the fate of Hellas. That man was Philip II. Born in 382 BCE, Philip was the youngest son of King Amyntas III. He spent part of his youth as a hostage in Thebes, where he observed firsthand the military innovations and political institutions of one of Greece's most formidable powers. He returned to Macedon with a keen understanding of Greek warfare, diplomacy, and the necessity of reform. When he ascended to the throne in 359 BCE, Macedon was teetering on collapse. Invaded by Illyrians, threatened by Paeonians, and riven with internal dissent, the kingdom seemed doomed. But Philip, with a mix of cunning, charisma, and brutality, transformed it. He began by reorganizing the army. Borrowing from Theban tactics and adding his own innovations, Philip created the Macedonian phalanx, a tight, disciplined formation of pikemen armed with the sarissa, a pike twice the length of the traditional Greek spear. He trained a professional standing army, loyal to the crown and drilled year-round. Cavalry units were enhanced, siege warfare refined, and military engineers employed. His diplomacy was equally shrewd. Philip married multiple times, forging alliances across the region. He used bribes, threats, and persuasion to bring neighboring tribes and cities under Macedonian influence. In some cases, he settled Greeks in Macedonian cities, blending cultures and strengthening ties. As Macedon grew in power, the southern Greeks began to take notice and alarm. Philip's campaigns against the northern tribes brought him wealth and prestige. When he intervened in Thessaly's internal disputes, he was hailed as a liberator. When he helped end the Third Sacred War by defeating the Phocians, he was admitted into the Amphictyonic Council, a religious political body that governed the sanctuary of Delphi. This gave Philip not only spiritual legitimacy, but also a voice in pan-Hellenic affairs. But not all welcomed Macedonian ascendancy. In Athens, the orator Demosthenes became Philip's fiercest critic. In a series of speeches known as the Philippics, he warned that Philip's ambitions threatened the freedom of all Greeks. "Philip is not only among us," Demosthenes thundered. "He is master of all." Despite these warnings, the Greek city-states remained divided. Some, like Thebes and Athens, tried to resist. Others, weary of war and seduced by Philip's gold, accepted his leadership. In 338 BCE, the tensions came to a head at the Battle of Chaeronea. There, Philip, alongside his teenage son Alexander, faced a coalition of Greek forces led by Athens and Thebes. The battle was fierce. The Macedonian phalanx held firm, while Alexander, commanding the companion cavalry, led a decisive charge that shattered the enemy's flank. The Greek resistance was crushed. Philip did not raise Athens or Thebes. Instead, he offered peace on his terms. He established the League of Corinth, a federation of Greek states under Macedonian leadership. Each city retained autonomy in local affairs, but all pledged loyalty to Philip and agreed to contribute forces for a grand campaign, the invasion of Persia. It was a masterstroke. Philip had achieved what generations of Greeks had dreamed of: unity. But his triumph was short-lived. In 336 BCE, as he prepared to launch his campaign against Persia, Philip was assassinated during the wedding of his daughter Cleopatra. The assassin, Pausanias of Orestis, was quickly killed, and the motives behind the murder remain a subject of speculation. Some suspect political intrigue, others whisper of domestic betrayal. Whatever the truth, the crown passed to his 20-year-old son, a young man tutored by Aristotle, tempered in battle, and burning with ambition. His name was Alexander. When Alexander III of Macedon ascended the throne in 336 BCE, the world stood on the cusp of monumental change. He was only 20 years old, but the boy who had ridden beside Philip II at Chaeronea, who had tamed the wild stallion Bucephalus as a child, and who had studied under the great philosopher Aristotle, was no ordinary youth. He was a warrior, a statesman, and a visionary whose ambition reached beyond the lands of Hellas to the very edges of the known world. His father's death had left the empire vulnerable, and enemies, both foreign and domestic, rushed to test the young king's resolve. Tribes in Thrace and Illyria rebelled. Thebes, emboldened by Philip's death, sought independence. But Alexander acted swiftly and ruthlessly. He marched north, crushed the tribal revolts with brutal efficiency, and then turned south. Thebes, defiant and unyielding, became an example. Alexander besieged the city, breached its defenses, and razed it to the ground. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. Over 6,000 Thebans were slain, and the survivors sold into slavery. The message was clear: rebellion would be met with annihilation. The Greek world was stunned. Athens, which had hesitated in its resistance, quickly submitted. The League of Corinth was reaffirmed under Alexander's leadership, and the young king turned his gaze eastward, toward Persia. The Persian Empire, under King Darius III, was vast, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley. It was a land of immense wealth, ancient cities, and diverse peoples. But it was also bloated, plagued by internal strife, and led by a king whose grip on power was tenuous. Alexander saw in it not just a military target, but a destiny. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with 40,000 men, infantry, cavalry, engineers, and scribes. At Troy, he paid homage to Achilles, claiming kinship with the mythical hero. His campaign would be as much a spiritual journey as a conquest. His first major engagement came at the river Granicus. The Persian satraps had massed their forces to meet him. Alexander led the cavalry charge himself, spear in hand, cutting down Persian nobles with ferocity. Though wounded, he inspired his men to a resounding victory. The path into Asia Minor was open. City after city fell: Sardis, Ephesus, Halicarnassus. Some surrendered, others resisted and were subdued. Alexander portrayed himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, freeing Greek cities from Persian control. He respected local customs, honored local deities, and won the loyalty of many. In 333 BCE, Alexander faced Darius himself at the Battle of Issus. Darius's army vastly outnumbered the Macedonians, but the terrain favored Alexander. With tactical brilliance, he exploited a narrow pass, led a furious assault on the Persian center, and caused Darius to flee the battlefield, abandoning his family and royal treasures. The image of the Persian king in flight would haunt the empire. Alexander treated Darius's captured family with dignity. "He is still your king," he told the queen mother, "and I am not your enemy." Such acts enhanced his reputation. From Issus, Alexander moved south, securing the Levantine coast. Tyre resisted, its island fortress seemingly impregnable. For 7 months, Alexander laid siege, constructing a causeway and battering the city until it fell. The punishment was severe. Thousands were killed or enslaved. Gaza followed, falling after a brutal assault. In 332 BCE, Alexander entered Egypt. The people, resentful of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. At Memphis, he was crowned pharaoh. At the oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, the priests hailed him as the son of Zeus Ammon. The declaration thrilled Alexander. Whether he believed it or not, he began to act the part of a god-king. He founded the city of Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile, envisioning it as a hub of Greek culture and trade. It would one day become the greatest city of the ancient world. In 331 BCE, Alexander marched east once more. At Gaugamela, he faced Darius in their final showdown. The Persian king had assembled a massive force: infantry, cavalry, scythed chariots, even elephants. But Alexander's tactical genius prevailed. He feigned retreat, created a gap in the Persian line, and then drove his companion cavalry into the breach. Darius again fled, and this time his empire began to crumble. Babylon opened its gates to Alexander. So did Susa, Persepolis, and Ecbatana. At Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, Alexander allowed his troops to plunder. Later, in a drunken rage, perhaps incited by the courtesan Thais, he ordered the city's palaces burned. Whether it was revenge for the Persian sack of Athens or an act of symbolic closure, the flames consumed the heart of the Achaemenid dynasty. Darius was eventually betrayed and murdered by his own men. When Alexander found his body, he mourned him, buried him with honor, and executed the traitors. He now claimed the title King of Asia. But Alexander's ambition was insatiable. He pushed further east, through the Zagros Mountains, into Bactria and Sogdiana. He faced fierce resistance, guerrilla warfare, and betrayal. Yet he pressed on, marrying the Bactrian princess Roxana to win local support and founding more cities to cement his rule. His army, though loyal, began to grow weary. They missed home, resented the orientalization of their leader, and feared the endless campaign. Still, Alexander drove them toward India. In 326 BCE, at the Battle of the Hydaspes, he faced King Porus, who commanded war elephants and a disciplined army. Despite the challenges, Alexander triumphed. Impressed by Porus's bravery, he reinstated him as a regional ruler. But the monsoon rains, the alien terrain, and years of campaigning took their toll. At the Hyphasis River, Alexander's troops refused to march further. After bitter protests, Alexander relented. The East would go unconquered. The return journey was harrowing. Through the Gidrosian desert, many perished from thirst and exhaustion. In Babylon, Alexander sought to consolidate his empire, plan new campaigns, and merge cultures. He adopted Persian dress, held mass weddings, and promoted Persians into high ranks. Some saw this as visionary, others as betrayal. In 323 BCE, Alexander fell ill, perhaps from fever, poison, or overindulgence. After days of agony, he died in Babylon at the age of 32. His final words, when asked to whom he left his empire, were, "To the strongest." His generals, the Diadochi, would tear the empire apart in brutal wars. But Alexander's legacy endured, a fusion of East and West, the spread of Hellenism, and a legend that would echo through the ages. With the sudden death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE, the ancient world entered a new era, an age of splintered glory, of fractured empires and cultural fusion. The Hellenistic Age, so named for the widespread dissemination of Greek or Hellenic language, art, politics, and thought across the former territories of Alexander's empire, was not an age of unity, but one of brilliant fragmentation. Alexander left no clear heir. His son, Alexander IV, was still unborn, and his half-brother, Aridaeus, was mentally unfit to rule. In the power vacuum, Alexander's most trusted generals, his Diadochi or successors, claimed portions of the empire for themselves, setting the stage for decades of brutal conflict. The wars of the Diadochi reshaped the political map. Ptolemy seized Egypt and founded a dynasty that would last nearly 3 centuries. Seleucus took control of the vast eastern territories, establishing the Seleucid Empire. Antigonus tried to hold the Asian heartlands but was ultimately defeated. Lysimachus and Cassander carved out realms in Asia Minor and Macedonia, respectively. The empire had shattered, but each shard retained a glimmer of Alexander's fire. Despite the bloodshed, the Hellenistic period was a time of unprecedented cultural diffusion and intellectual vitality. Greek became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Cities, old and new, flourished under Greek administration, architecture, and learning. Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, Pergamon in Asia Minor, all rose as centers of scholarship, commerce, and art. In Alexandria, under the rule of the Ptolemies, a remarkable cultural experiment unfolded. The city housed the Library of Alexandria, a vast repository of knowledge believed to contain hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Scholars from across the known world gathered here, poets, scientists, philosophers. Euclid laid the foundations of geometry. Archimedes pursued mechanical inventions. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy. The Museion, or museum, served as a think tank, blending Eastern and Western ideas in a spirit of inquiry and exploration. Elsewhere, the fusion of Greek and local traditions gave rise to unique artistic and religious expressions. In Bactria and India, Hellenistic kings minted coins with Greek and Sanskrit inscriptions. Greek gods mingled with Eastern deities. Zeus became equated with Amun, Apollo with Mithras. In Gandhara, Greek sculptural styles influenced Buddhist art, producing serene statues of the Buddha with flowing togas and classical features. But the era was not solely one of enlightenment. The Hellenistic kingdoms were marked by constant warfare, dynastic intrigue, and fragile legitimacy. Kings claimed divine ancestry, adopting royal cults to bolster their status. Court life grew decadent, and the common people, increasingly alienated, turned to mystery religions and Eastern spiritualism for solace. In Greece itself, the classical city-states never fully recovered their independence. Athens remained a beacon of philosophy, home to schools founded by Plato and Aristotle, but its political power waned. Sparta declined into obscurity. The Aetolian and Achaean leagues attempted to revive collective strength, but internal rivalries persisted. One vivid example of the Hellenistic paradox, splendor amidst instability, was the reign of the Seleucid king Antiochus, the fourth Epiphanes. A patron of Hellenism, he imposed Greek customs on Judea, sparking the Maccabean revolt. His rule exemplified both the ambition and overreach of the era. By the 2nd century BCE, a new power loomed on the western horizon: Rome. The Roman Republic, once a regional Italian power, had begun its eastward march. Macedon fell in a series of wars, culminating in the defeat of King Perseus at Pydna in 168 BCE. The Seleucid Empire fractured under internal dissent and Parthian pressure. Egypt, weakened by dynastic strife, fell increasingly under Roman influence. In 146 BCE, Corinth was sacked, and Greece was formally annexed into the Roman Republic. Though the spirit of Hellenism endured, the age of Greek political independence had ended. Alexandria and Athens would remain centers of learning, but the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. And yet, the legacy of Hellenistic Greece was profound. Its art, science, and philosophy laid the groundwork for Roman civilization. Its blend of cultures shaped the spiritual and intellectual life of the Mediterranean for centuries to come. The dream of Alexander, a world united through shared ideals, if not shared rule, remained an echo in every library, marketplace, and temple of the ancient world. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the world of independent Greek city-states had receded into memory. The proud polis that once dictated the cultural and political tempo of the Mediterranean now found themselves under the control of a distant power, Rome. But the Roman occupation was not a sudden conquest. It was a slow tightening of influence, a political metamorphosis that saw Greece gradually absorbed into the orbit of a rising Western titan. Rome's first direct encounter with Greece had come through diplomacy and conflict. The Romans, expanding eastward after securing Italy, found themselves embroiled in Greek affairs through the Pyrrhic Wars, 280 to 275 BCE, when King Pyrrhus of Epirus attempted to halt Roman dominance in southern Italy. Though tactically skilled, his costly victories against the Romans were unsustainable, giving rise to the term Pyrrhic victory. In the decades that followed, Rome grew bolder. The Macedonian Wars, fought between 214 and 148 BCE, were the decisive blows. Rome faced off against the Antigonid kings of Macedon, Philip V, and later his son Perseus. The Battle of Cynocephalae in 197 BCE saw the Roman legion triumph over the Macedonian phalanx, a pivotal moment in military history. By 168 BCE, at the Battle of Pydna, Perseus was defeated, and Macedon was reduced to a Roman province. In 146 BCE, the sack of Corinth sent a clear signal. Greece was no longer the master of its destiny. But Rome did not raise Greece, it restructured it. The Romans were deeply admiring of Greek culture. Greek tutors taught the children of Roman elites. Greek art adorned Roman villas. Philosophers such as Stoics and Epicureans profoundly influenced Roman thought. Even Cicero, the great Roman orator, was steeped in Greek rhetoric. To rule Greece was not to destroy it, but to preserve it as a jewel in the imperial crown. The city of Athens remained a hub of learning, its schools attracting students from across the empire. The Academy, founded by Plato, and the Lyceum, established by Aristotle, endured as centers of philosophical debate. Roman emperors, including Augustus and Hadrian, patronized Athens and other Greek cities. Hadrian, a Philhellene, even commissioned grand architectural works in Athens, including a massive library and the completion of the temple of Olympian Zeus. Yet not all was harmonious. Greek pride bristled under Roman rule. There were occasional revolts, such as the Achaean resistance culminating in the sack of Corinth. Some cities experienced decline, their economies diminished and their autonomy curtailed. Taxes were levied, Roman governors installed, and the once fierce independence of the polis faded into ceremonial memory. The spiritual life of Greece also began to shift. Mystery cults like those of Dionysus, Demeter, and Orpheus grew in popularity, offering salvation and ecstatic experience beyond the reach of traditional civic religion. Greek gods persisted, but increasingly merged with Roman counterparts, Zeus with Jupiter, Athena with Minerva. Temples still stood, incense still burned, but the rituals had evolved. In this atmosphere of subdued autonomy, new religious and philosophical currents took root. Cynicism, Stoicism, and Epicureanism flourished among the educated elite. These schools of thought emphasized virtue, logic, and self-discipline in a world now governed by empire, not city-state. In the 1st century BCE and into the Common Era, another transformative presence arrived in the Greek world: Christianity. Paul the Apostle famously preached in Athens, addressing the philosophers at the Areopagus. Initially, Christianity was seen as a fringe sect, yet it resonated with the spiritual hunger of the age. As centuries passed, it would grow from a persecuted movement into the dominant faith of the empire. By the time of the Roman Empire's zenith, Greece had become a cultural province rather than a political force. Its artists, scholars, and mystics remained in demand, but its armies and assemblies no longer shaped the world. The city-states, once fractious and fiery, had become tranquil stones in the mosaic of empire. And yet, Greece endured, not as a political power, but as a spiritual and intellectual compass. The silent citadel of Greece whispered its wisdom through the centuries, through Rome, through Byzantium, through the Renaissance and beyond. As the dust of conquests settled and the empires of old faded into the pages of history, the legacy of ancient Greece refused to be buried. Though its political dominance waned, its intellectual, cultural, and philosophical influence endured, lighting the path for generations that followed. The enduring flame of Greece, its thoughts, its ideals, its art, continues to flicker across time. The legacy of ancient Greece is multifaceted. It lies first in its intellectual contributions. The seeds sown by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle blossomed into entire fields of inquiry: logic, ethics, metaphysics, politics. Greek thought laid the cornerstone of Western philosophy. Plato's Republic envisioned an ideal society governed by philosopher kings. Aristotle's Politics dissected forms of government, influencing civic theory into the modern era. In the sciences, figures like Pythagoras, Euclid, Archimedes, and Hippocrates transformed human understanding. Mathematics became a tool for discovering universal truths. Geometry, astronomy, medicine, all flourished in the fertile soil of Hellenic curiosity. The Hippocratic Oath, in one form or another, still echoes in the chambers of medical schools today. Greek drama and literature offered a mirror to the human soul. The tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides explored fate, morality, and the flaws of kings. Comedy, too, thrived. Aristophanes skewered politicians and philosophers alike. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, whether myth or memory, became sacred texts of Western literature, shaping how we tell stories, define heroism, and interpret war and homecoming. In politics, the Greek legacy is profound. Athenian democracy, imperfect and exclusionary though it was, introduced the radical idea of citizen participation in governance. The concept of debate, the vote, the jury. These flourished first in Athens. Though only a fraction of the population had voice or vote, the blueprint was laid. The idea that power should be accountable to the people would later inspire revolutions in America and France and echo through the chambers of the United Nations. Architecturally, the Greeks left behind marble testaments to symmetry, proportion, and grandeur. The Parthenon atop the Acropolis, dedicated to Athena, remains a symbol of refined beauty and civic pride. Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns became the language of temples, courthouses, and capitals around the world. Religion, too, bore Greek marks. Though Christianity would come to dominate Europe, it absorbed much from the Hellenic world. Its language, as the New Testament was written in Greek, its philosophical frameworks, even its art forms. Icons and saints carried echoes of older gods. Churches mirrored temples in their form. Greek concepts of the soul and the afterlife shaped Christian theology in profound ways. The Byzantine Empire preserved Greek texts and traditions for over a millennium after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Scholars in Constantinople maintained the classical canon, translating and commenting upon ancient works. When the city fell in 1453, Greek scholars fled westward, carrying texts and ideas that would ignite the European Renaissance. In Florence and Venice, in Paris and London, the thinkers of the Renaissance looked back to Greece as the source of wisdom. They studied Plato and Aristotle, drew inspiration from Greek sculpture, and revived classical ideals of balance, reason, and humanism. The rediscovery of Greece fueled not only art and philosophy, but science, politics, and literature. During the Enlightenment, thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Jefferson drew directly from Greek models. The idea of a republic, the pursuit of rational inquiry, the celebration of individual rights, all found their roots in Athens. The flame still burned. In modern Greece, the legacy is both tangible and spiritual. The ruins remain, not as relics, but as anchors. Tourists walk among the stones of Delphi and Olympia, Athens and Corinth. The language has evolved but retains echoes of the ancient tongue. The identity of a people is bound to its ancestry, and modern Greeks remain heirs to that ancient grandeur. But beyond borders, Greek heritage belongs to the world. The Olympic Games, reborn in the modern era, carry the torch, literally, of ancient athletic ideals. In classrooms from Sydney to Cairo, students still grapple with the logic of Socrates and the poetry of Sappho. In governments across the globe, parliaments, senates, and constitutions owe a debt to the agora. And so the story of ancient Greece does not end. It transforms. From Minoan palaces to Mycenaean tombs, from the Delphic oracle to the columns of the Acropolis, from the dialogues of Plato to the laws of Solon, the tale continues to unfold in every mind that questions, in every voice that debates, in every heart that aspires to truth and beauty. The enduring flame of Greece is not a ruin. It is a living light, a beacon across millennia, a whisper through stone, a thought that will never fade. This is the legacy of ancient Greece, a memory made eternal, a civilization that still speaks, a fire that never dies.